Hey there everyone, it's Baka here and welcome back to our special two-part episode about death in comics. Now, last week we looked at the revolving door that is death in comics. This week I want to focus on the deaths in comics that are fairly shocking. Now, these might be because a character is so beloved or so important to the brand that it's shocking that they could ever be killed off. And the other is a character that is killed off to make the story that much more heartbreaking, that much more devastating to the main character. And I want to start off with some of these big guns being killed off. Now, this happens from time to time. We talked about some of them last week. The first one I want to talk about is Superman. Now, Superman is the flagship character of DC Comics, obviously. He's been around longer than everyone else. He is, the go-to guy for big superhero team-ups and storylines. And during the whole, what do you want to call it? The whole Doomsday storyline, it was kind of weird because Superman wasn't getting involved. Doomsday is clearly making a path of destruction right towards Metropolis. And it's not till he gets there, or just about gets there, that Superman even steps in. The entire Justice League is just decimated by Doomsday. And Superman finally gets in there, and it becomes a knockdown, drag-out fight. All along, you're pretty much under the impression, okay, Superman's going to get beat down, but he's going to come back and he's going to win. And then, he defeats Doomsday, but Doomsday defeats him as well. He punches him to death. There's, one of the most iconic images in comics, at least from the last few decades, is Lois Lane holding Superman's broken body. It's very similar to Superman holding Supergirl's broken body in Crisis on Infinite Earths. So that one's shocking. Now, it wasn't a comic book death that lasted very long, but it was a shocking comic book death. I mean, this is the flagship character of all comic book characters, and he's dead. People had played with killing off characters for a little while, big name characters, never the biggest name characters, not till then. With Superman's death, you were able to have characters like Green Arrow, Green Lantern, Batman, Captain America, Spider-Man, all bite the big one, and all eventually come back. Now, what becomes really shocking is when you take characters that don't necessarily have a huge role to play in a story. They might be sidekicks, they might be girlfriends or wives or partners, or somebody who's important to the main character, but not the main character. Jason Todd, Bucky Barnes, killing them off fairly early in their careers. They're both sidekicks. It changed how their superhero reacted to life. Now, in Captain America's case, he was already, freezing into an iceberg while Bucky was plummeting to his doom. Batman never got over Jason Todd. Even when Jason Todd came back, it was almost worse for Batman. Batman might have gotten some closure. He had a third Robin, he'd had a fourth Robin, he'd gone back to the third Robin, and Jason Todd comes back and he's crazy. There are characters like the Young X-Men, a comic book that was around in the early 2000s that was kind of a relaunching of the New Mutants, but with a new generation. And the New Mutants were basically their mentors and teachers. And you have characters like William Stryker, who's a human, hates mutants, has pieces of Nimrod technology going on, and he bombs a bus of depowered mutants. Just blows them out of the water. You have the death of 20 to 30 children. Absolutely shocking. That series came pretty much to be known for who's gonna die next. It was kind of like watching a Joss Whedon show because you didn't know who was going to bite it next. But then you have some of the most shocking deaths, and that is, those characters that are loved ones. You don't mess with the superhero's family. There's a common term in comics called women in refrigerators. This comes from a storyline in Green Lantern number 54 when Kyle Rayner had just become Green Lantern. He didn't have any of his signature suits. He was still, he was just fresh new to the game, and he had a girlfriend named Alex DeWitt. Now, in some of his earliest adventures, he came across the villain Major Force, who is not even a Green Lantern villain. He's a Captain Atom villain. But he's a psychotic, he's a military-trained guy, and he enjoys inflicting pain. And he finds out who Green Lantern is. He stalks Alex DeWitt, he kills her, and he shoves her body into a refrigerator for Green Lantern to find. And this is a death that not only was shocking because of its brutality. This is a mainstream DC comic still going under the Comic Codes Authority, and they shove a woman in a refrigerator, basically dismembered, contorted. It's disgusting. It makes Green Lantern fly into a rage and almost brutally murder Major Force. It changes him from being this, happy-go-lucky artist who lucked upon a Green Lantern ring to taking it seriously. Alex DeWitt is a character that never left Kyle Rayner's mind. She was even brought back very briefly in Darkest Night as a zombie Alex DeWitt, just to mess with Kyle's mind. Now, the whole women in refrigerators thing sparked this huge outrage amongst fans, amongst female comic book writers and artists, and it brought to light a pretty, I don't even know what to say, an occurrence that's not nearly rare enough, in that if you're a female character in comics and if you don't have your name on the cover of that comic, good luck staying alive. And a lot of this was thought to be an anti-feminist movement that, you only do this because it's women. And I've thought about this a lot. This was the main reason I even started Uncanny, because I wanted to talk about this topic, this women in refrigerators topic. And yeah, I'm a guy. Scruffy beard and all. And it might not be my place to be speaking out on a topic like this, but if you think about who most comic book writers are, and who, for at least years and years, the main audience for comic books were, it was guys. Now, obviously originally it was meant for younger audiences, but that's all changed. Most kids, they only know the superheroes from the movies and the toys. And so it's mostly teenagers, young adults, people going into their 30s, 40s, 50s that are reading the major storyline comics. And one thing that every adult or near adult male can get behind is, you don't mess with my loved ones. You don't mess with my girlfriend. You don't mess with my wife. You don't mess with my kids. When something happens that is that horrible, it strikes a chord in most men's brains as, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. This story just became really personal to me. Even though it's a fictional character that, doesn't really even matter that much to the story, this is now personal. You had the rape and murder of Sue Dibney in Identity Crisis. That being one of the most shocking, most horrifying things you could ever imagine. You know, I don't personally think that the women in comics are there to die. No, that's not their purpose. When something bad happens to them, though, it is a galvanizing force for the hero, for the reader. You know, the reader does not want to read about a woman or a child being brutally murdered. But when it happens, that story becomes much more personal to them. And that's one of the goals of a writer, is to make a personal story for the reader. So, is it horrible that it's happening to women? And if you Google women in refrigerators, you'll come across an archived website with a list of all of these women who've died, or been changed, or tortured, and it's a huge list. I was scrolling and I didn't get barely down the A's, and I was, 3 or 4 pages in. It's a horrible thing to have happen, but it is a way to make a story brutally personal. Now, there are shocking male deaths and, horrible things that happen to males. Batman was raped. Nightwing has been raped at least once, I think twice. Green Arrow's been raped. They've all been, except for Nightwing, they've all been murdered. But it's not as shocking. It's not as gut-wrenching, at least to a guy. Now, if the storyline were, say, a story starring a woman, and for just the sake of picking a major female character, I'm going to pull out Wonder Woman. And this makes it a little more difficult because of her relationship with men and it being kind of weird. But if Wonder Woman was being written, and she had a love interest, and it was a really deep relationship, and then one of her villains came and brutally murdered him, that might, for women readers, have a much more have that same sort of shocking thing. But maybe not. Maybe it's the society we live in where the torture, the beating, the murder of a woman is horrifying. Much more so than it is for a guy. Maybe that's sexist, but honestly, that's society, at least Western society. Now, when it comes to children being murdered, that's a whole other ballgame. That's where everyone can come in and say, "Oh my gosh, you did what? This is horrifying." Arthur Curry Jr. being murdered. This was years and years ago. This was years before I was born. Aquaman. His son was murdered. It set him off. It set everyone off. It ruined his marriage. It ruined, And I'm the biggest mocker of Aquaman ever. But that's a storyline I get behind because it's such a personal, eviscerating story. Young X-Men. I, personally, some of my favorite comics have to do with teen superheroes. The Teen Titans, before that, Young Justice, New Mutants, Young X-Men, Young Avengers, etc., etc. And when they started dying off in horrible ways, and in shocking ways, like, oh great, everything's gonna be okay, bam, shot in the head, dead. Or, oh, it's such a sad thing, all these kids have to go home because they lost their mutant powers, but, they get to go and they get to live their lives, boom, blown up by a missile hitting their bus. There's nothing like the death of a child. I have not had to experience this personally. I have had friends who've died when we were children, though, and it's numbing, it's shocking. So, comics is a form of literature. It's a form of literature, it's a form of art, and you bring these two together and you get a written and visual way of expressing these ideas that plague everyone's minds at some point or another. So, yeah, while in a lot of cases superheroes can come back from the dead, there are still plenty of cases where it doesn't happen, and the fact that that doesn't happen makes those deaths more important. It makes it more shocking. And it's something that is going to continue throughout comics. Whether it be the death of female loved ones or children, or just the death of side characters. People were upset when Dan Turpin died after being possessed by Darkseid. Now, they quickly got rid of that with, the New 52, but still, Dan Turpin, this big, burly guy, human, side character, buddies with, the Justice League. It was a very personal character. People were upset. They weren't horribly upset, but they were upset. So, there's a lot of shocking moments in comics. There's a lot of shocking deaths. And eventually I'm going to be having a top 5 coming up where we look at the most shocking deaths in comics. And yeah, I've just talked about some of them right here. But there are ones that I might not have mentioned. There might be ones that I haven't thought about. So, what are your guys' thoughts? What do you think about the whole women in refrigerators concept, about shocking deaths in comics, about death in comics in general? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, that'd be awesome. And until next week, this is Baka, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.